Hello, welcome to part 2 of drawing a barn owl. Hope you're excited. Today we're going to be working on drawing the bill and also some of the feathers like in this area and up here. As you can see, I did add in a few down here and around the eye on this side. Basically, when you're sketching the feathers in here, I did include a bit of a shadow. So I used like some medium cold grays to do that. And another thing I wanted to point out, as I was shading, I wanted to include this little line here, which is where the mouth line is, which if you look very closely at your photo, you'll see that the mouth is kind of going up here. And the feathers that are coming over the top, they're obscuring quite a bit of the bill. So with this owl, we really just have this lower part of the bill visible. And that's what we'll start with today. So to start, I'm just going to erase these graphite lines until they're just barely visible as a guide. And some colors that you'll want for the bill are like warm grays, and I would also take out, this is beige red, kind of a funny name for this color, but it's basically a very light pink. So a light pink, we will add a little bit of that to the bill, but we may have some mixture of warm grays and cold grays, mostly fairly light to medium colors for the bill. And then we will also be smoothing those colors out to make the bill look really nice and smooth, because that's what the texture looks like. So to start, I'm just going to do a base layer of warm gray 1, which is this one here. And it can be good, to outline your bill a little bit so you have that border. I'm really going to erase this pretty well up here. And then, of course, we are going to have texture coming over the top of the bill, which I am going to use probably a little bit of the electric eraser to add that in. For something like this, that's smooth, you can actually do somewhat circular strokes that will help to keep it looking smooth rather than like always up and down. And always keeping in mind, we want this to look three-dimensional with the bill above these feathers here. Oh, and just a reminder, if you have any questions throughout this class, feel free to type them into the chat box. I'm always happy to answer questions. The next color I'm going to take out is slightly darker warm gray 4, and I'm just going to start putting in some of the shadowy areas. And you'll notice if you look closely at the photo that there's actually, this is a shadow, but there's also what's called some reflected light here, like at the edge of the shadow. Which, that is a thing that happens where you'll have some reflected light. It's not just a complete shadowy area here. Why don't I demonstrate exactly what I mean by that? So, if you have a sphere like this, and the light's coming from this direction, you'll have shadows here, but you'll also have, oftentimes, sitting on a surface, this little edge area where there's like some reflected light here. So some light that's bouncing off of here. And it's very subtle. And that's what we're trying to get on the bill. And if you accidentally draw into that area, it's okay. You can just erase. Make a bit of a darker outline on the side as well. And always keep in mind the shape that you see. It's very triangular. And then, to blend the shadow into the lighter area, we will go over it with a lighter color. You can put a little bit of shadow here, but it's not quite as dark. And then lighter pressure as you go towards the middle of the bill to give it like that sort of conical appearance. Now I'm going to smooth that out a bit using this ivory pencil. Or you can use a white if you don't have ivory. And I'm using fairly hard pressure just to sort of smooth it out. It's almost like a yellowish white, kind of. I'm not going quite to this edge either. So I'm sort of stopping at the border of the shadow. And then I'm going to use, for that line, I'm going to just use white because I want it to look pretty bright there. But I always like to smooth out the base layer, or I should say almost always like to smooth out the base layer, and it's particularly important for a surface like this that is smooth in texture. And then I also want to add in a little bit of that pink because you can kind of see it at the end of the bow and also a little bit on this side too. So just a hint of it. Which can also be blended once again with a white or an ivory pencil. And if you start to lose it too much, you know, like the white gets rid of it basically by smoothing it out too much, you can go back in with another layer too. All right, now I'm gonna start blocking in a little bit of the feathers that are coming over the top. Should say wisping in, sounds like a better word. So for that, I'm actually going to start with sort of the mid-range color. So let's see, I think I'll use burnt ochre, this one here. So it's like a light reddish or orangish brown basically. And you want it to be pretty sharp. I'm going to sharpen this even more actually. Because we're going to start adding the texture of the feathers over the top. And just do little wispy strokes. Again, think though about the shape of a feather when you're drawing. So you can see it on some of these feathers. The middle part of the feather, and then the barbs coming off the sides, like we talked about last time. Yeah, so especially with a barn owl, because they have very fur-like feathers, it's important on the facial disc to remember that the barbs don't all go in the same direction. And you have a nice up-close photo like this, because it will start to look more like fur than feathers if you do that. So remember from last time, we drew like lines for the middle part of the feather here, and then we had the barbs coming off basically in two different directions. So we can do that same thing here. You can have just a few feathers coming over the top like this. These are the middle parts. And then add the barbs coming off the sides. Just like that. And you may say, it's not really showing up very well over the top of the bill. And actually, I'm going to add in some dark areas, and then we're going to go over that with the electric eraser. Which, if you don't have an electric eraser, I would recommend, if you have a kneaded eraser or something like that, it might work. But you can try using a regular one, basically, to erase in some of those highlights. But adding this also is going to increase the contrast and make the light areas pop a bit more. So you might even be able to get away with not using an eraser. Again, for the dark areas, have your pencil really sharp. And I'm using dark sepia, or any kind of really dark brown will work well. And you can actually, I think, sort of see there's like these darker spots here, which is sort of the start of the nostrils on either side. But they're mostly obscured by feathers. And then if you wanted to increase the contrast, and you do happen to have a tool like this, an electric eraser, again, this is something you have to practice with, but basically I go like this. Didn't work quite as well as I had hoped, but part of that is it erased the shadows. So I can come back in with the shadows and up the contrast again. And then also use the burnt ochre a little more, just lightly. So remember, keep looking at your photo and keep looking at how much contrast you have going on there. Don't be afraid to add dark areas in, because that's really what you need to do to get that 3D kind of a look. Okay. And that's looking pretty good. I'm going to add a little bit of Caput Mortuum in there too, which is like a deeper reddish brown. Especially around where the nostrils are. Just a tiny bit of that. So now The next thing that I'd like to do, starting up on some of the higher feathers, is I'm going to just delineate basically where on each side of the face the feathers come in and meet each other. So if you're looking at the photo, you can see pretty clearly there's a line right down the middle. And just in a medium gray, I'm going to add sort of a texture line. So I'm going to use Cold Gray 4 for that. Just to keep in mind where it is as we go along. And we will darken it up later, but I can erase this too. Okay. And now, let's see, what do I want to do next? Let's work on this area up here. So to start, I'm going to use as a base layer the lightest color, which is like a cold gray. I'm going to use a pretty light cold gray, like a cold gray 1. And I'm just going to add in feathers going around here. Now, it's like they're rays coming out like that, right? So keep that in mind as you're drawing the feathers. I'm going to try and zoom in so hopefully you can see. Because I don't want to get too dark when I'm doing this, but I also want to make sure you can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to eventually go over the top of that with like cadmium orange and burnt ochre and things like that. But for now, we're just going to use this as a base. And just pay close attention to the direction that I'm going here, and also look a bit at your reference photo, because just in case you can't actually see the lines very well. Yeah, that is hard to see on the screen, isn't it? If you're having too much trouble seeing, feel free to let me know. I'm hoping you can at least tell the direction I'm going in. Because if you can't see, I will do a little side demo with a darker pencil. You know what, why don't I just do that anyway, because I can do it real quick. So, let's say the eyes right here. I, of course, have these ones coming off, which I already did last time. And yeah, here's the disc. Goofy little picture. Here's the bill. And then I have them coming up like this, basically rays. So that's what you want to aim for. Well, sort of. Maybe aim for a bit less of a doodle than this, but alright. So I'll just take the cold gray and start to finish up some of these. Using pretty light pressure. And this is one of those times that I'm not going to worry too much about a base layer, because we have some strands in there that are almost like a pure white. So if we have a little bit of paper that's showing through, that's not a huge deal. It's actually a good thing. It can help us. And now I'm going to take cadmium orange and start putting in the more orangey areas. that are around the eye. So this is like the next color layer. Of course, I'm going to be going over the top of this with some browns as well, but this is just to start here. And I'm going just midway out on the feather. Actually, for some of them, it's pretty far out, actually. So just look at your photo and try to show, you know, the amount of orange that's being portrayed there. But then as you get closer to the top of the eye, there's less orange. Or I should say, it doesn't go out as far. Just kind of like that. So next, I'm going to take the burnt ochre again and bring in some of the more like middle tone areas. And you want your pencil to be pretty sharp to get that texture in there. Oh, and also when you get close to the eye here, there's this part that's quite a bit darker above the eyelid, and we will work on this eyelid part in a little bit too. So you can add in a line to show where that is, but we'll also darken it up a bit momentarily. There are a lot of different colors going on here. So next, I'm going to use some burnt umber for the darker areas. Notice I said darker, not darkest, because we're going to come in with one more color after this. So take a look at your reference photo if you have it, and notice where those darker areas are. A lot of it mostly is close to the eye. And some of those feather strands that look pretty short, the areas that are dark anyway. And then we can also make this part of this line a little darker too. Alright. And finally, I'm going to use some dark sepia for the darkest shadows. Always remembering to go in the direction of feather barbs. You can kind of blend it together with this burnt ochre too, in spots. And then right here. And using fairly hard pressure in this area because it's like there's a lot of pigment in there. You'll notice from the photo. Looks like we have a little shine from the light maybe. Let me just try to reposition. Oh, I guess it's not that bad. Hopefully you all can see. Alrighty. Pretty good. Another color that most colored pencil sets have that can be useful for stuff like this is burnt sienna. It's a nice reddish brown. So some of these reddish browns, if you don't have them in your colored pencil set, you probably do have burnt sienna. So you can use like that combined with a light orange or something. That would work pretty well. So now in the white areas, I'm gonna add some darker strands too. With a cold gray. It takes me a minute to decide what number. I think a cold gray 4 will be about right. It's a pretty medium color. I mean medium shade. And you want it to be sharp, and that's just going to be the shadows in between some of these strands here. Even sharper. And I like to zoom in. If you have the ability, if you have this on a computer, you can zoom in on the photo and really see the details of the feathers nicely. I also sometimes use, it's called the magnify tool, to help me see the colors of an area really well. It sort of zooms in on that area that you're wanting to look at. And as you get up here, you'll notice it's very textured. And you'll also want to erase the graphite, if you're using colored pencil, along here until you can barely see it, so it's just a guideline. And then we can keep going with those feathers all the way around. But we're not going to add in the orange yet. We're just going to do cold gray 1 in this section here. Continuing with those rays of feathers coming off of where the eye is, basically. But it will be fun when we add in the orange here, because we have some darker shadows in here, and that's going to add some nice dimension to the face. And then as you get to this area, some of the feathers curve a bit more. All right, so now let's use cadmium orange again. But the first thing I want to do, actually, which can be good to do with things like this, actually, is to use some dark colors first before I go in with that orange, because I just want to show where the eyelid is, since we did not draw that in yet. So take a look at your reference photo and notice the shape of that. And yeah, it's going to come up like this. Oh, I need to do some erasing actually. So you kind of have this little line here that ends abruptly, and then you have the eyelid that comes across like this. And then it gets a bit thinner here, and then wider up here at the top of the curve. And if you zoom in, you can see there's a little bit of texture here from the skin, like some little bumps kind of here. And then it's pretty dark, so I'm going to use, well, first I am going to use a few layers. I'm going to start with cadmium orange, and then go over the top with terracotta. Which is a nice dark orangish brown. This one. And a little bit of burnt umber. Especially when you get to the area that's very close to the eye, because that area is a little less orange. It's really getting a bit nitpicky there, but that's how I am. You'll notice when you do these kinds of drawings, the more you do them, the more things you'll notice, and including some of the more subtle things. And notice too that there's this shadow like right here. And burnt umber is a really nice color to use for that. So make a textury shadow like that. Sometimes it is good to bring shadows in first, because if you don't, you're never going to make them as dark as they really need to be. And that is something that I'm trying to work on, because I have a tendency not to make things dark enough. Which, you know, if you do that, things will look a little flat. You really want to have contrasts and light and shadow. That's what makes drawings look more real. So now I'm going to use the cadmium orange and start a base layer for these feathers here. So notice how they come up here, and then there's this little part at the top here that goes across too. And you'll see what I mean as I put it in, just in case you're not looking at the photo. There's a lot of orange in here, so any light yellowy orange will do, but I really like the cadmium orange, which I think Prismacolor has that as well, if you're using Prismacolors. Actually, too, when you get up here, there's more yellowy stuff going on. I'm gonna grab a yellow pencil. So, like light cadmium yellow would be good. Any kind of light yellow up in here, and you can mix that with the cadmium orange. And then you have some orange that's coming out almost to the edge of the facial disc here. Oops, I got a little dark. And then we have a little bit coming up like this too. At the ends of some of those feathers, there's some orange. All right. So now let's add some darker colors like the burnt ochre. Similar technique to before, but keep in mind we have a pretty deep shadow in this area. So we can add some more of the burnt ochre in that area. And use fairly hard pressure as well. And try to blend that shadow, that darkest area, into the medium area with the burnt ochre. Yeah, and we are going to need to up some of the contrast on that eyelid too. Walnut brown is a good one to add in here too a little bit. I'm sorry, I use so many colors sometimes. I hope it doesn't get confusing. But this is another pencil that I use a lot. It's pretty similar to the burnt umber. It's a very similar color. It's just like a little bit more neutral. It's going to be hard. This is the burnt umber here. And this is the walnut brown. Probably can't see the difference over Facebook Live, but anyway, this one's a little more neutral, not as red. These orange-brown colors are really fun to use. And they show up a lot in nature too. Barn owls are really fun to draw on colored pencil. If you look up barn owl tutorials online, you'll actually find quite a few of them. So if you're looking for other tips, you can just do a Google search on YouTube and a lot of stuff will come up. In fact, I saw one artist was using the same exact photo. Because it's copyright free. And it's a really nice photo in my opinion. Definitely is. Alright, so you'll see when I have these deeper areas here, shadowy areas, that I've been using much darker pressure than like when I was doing these light gray areas. Definitely helps to deepen it. And now, I'm just going to use dark sepia because it's very, very dark, some of these shadows. Right in here. Oops, no, I don't want to go that far down. There we go. And then you can see, you know, because there's such a contrast, that the texture is very evident, like kind of in this area here. So try to have your pencil really sharp and show the contrast between some of those dark strands and the lighter ones here. Okay. Do a little blending with the orange if you like, but you want to keep that contrast. It's not quite as dark here, so I'm using burnt umber instead of the dark sepia. Okay. I hope that's showing up fairly well because some of the subtleties might be a bit tricky to see. Might actually zoom out because the quality will look a bit better. Here we go. So now I'm using a medium gray again, a cold gray 4 for some of the shadows in the gray areas. Oh, and I did want to put some of the burnt ochre in here too. Sometimes I'll find myself doing this thing where I'm holding 2 pencils. It's okay, it works. So then we're just going to go around. And then you have a few strands that are kind of just wispy, short filament type feathers, it looks like, coming up here, which you can add. So now we can start to define some of these edges a little bit better using a darker gray. Actually, use my magnifier tool. Definitely some kind of brown in there too. So I'm going to mix the dark sepia with a cold gray, no, actually a warm gray 6. So I'll just start sort of here. And what you want to keep in mind is that the feathers are coming up like this and they're like hitting each other at this point right here, which is pretty cool. So you want to show some very short textury parts at the ends of the feathers here, going in both directions. So let me just zoom in on a sticky just to show you exactly what I mean in case you just need to see it a little bit bigger. Drawing it right now. Yeah, so like that. The feathers are hitting each other right along that line. And you'll notice there's more shadow in certain areas than others. So like down here near the bill, there's quite a bit. But these shadowy parts, it's a very thin line here. And you'll often see this with animals with fur too. Sometimes you'll see spots where the fur is coming from different directions and meeting in one spot. And that can be tricky to draw. Takes some practice, especially with fur. So as you're doing it, also look at these feathers that you drew here, which don't have to be exactly the same as a picture, but if you have, this feather here, you want to show that texture following the form of that feather more or less. And then if you see parts where it's a little darker, you can add some kind of darker spots. Just so it doesn't look like unnaturally uniform. Especially down here. Okay. And then we're going to want to do the same thing around the edge as well. Although, you know, at the top edge, it's really not going to be very shadowy. Instead, we can use more like an orange. Oh, and I said I was going to put a little dark sepia, especially right in here. So yeah, the top edge we're just going to sort of border it with orange, and then the bottom edge we'll use gray. So I'm actually, gonna use burnt ochre right here and just make very short strokes just to define that edge. Textured strokes, again following the form of the feathers below. A little more down here too. That just helps you create a little bit of an outline. Then as we come around this curve here, we can start to use gray instead, because if you're looking at the photo, you can see that the shadows get darker. So I'm going to use the warm gray 6 again. Following the form of the feathers. And bring a little more shadow into this area too. It's actually more of a cold gray, so I'll use like a cold gray 4. And you know, when I say these numbers of these grays, you don't have to use exactly what I'm using. If you're using Prismacolor, it's going to be in percentages. So the cold gray 4 would be probably the equivalent of like 50% gray in Prismacolor sets, because it uses percentages rather than numbers. But you can, you know, look at the shade of the pencil that I'm using to try and guesstimate it. All right. Pretty good. I also want to just talk a little bit about those really short, stiff feathers around the edge of the facial disc, so we can work on some of those a little bit. And I'll show you, you know, both the top edge, the side, and the bottom, so that you can work on those a little bit more on your own before next class, because they're all sort of different shades on the top, middle, and bottom edges. So we'll start with the top. We have some very bright orange going on right here in this area. I'm going to erase this graphite. And that color is really pretty much exactly cadmium orange, which is nice. It's nice when a color is like exactly the same as the pencil. So you can use fairly hard pressure here. Especially at this edge where you can see that the pigment is really bright. Don't go up too far because when you get up to here, you know, it's gray. And we are not going to quite do that part yet. So you can really nicely see the borders of some of these feathers, which is fun. So what I like to do when that happens is you put in a base layer like this, but keep in mind the direction basically that the barbs are going. And then you can further define it with some of your medium and darker colors. But try really to follow. I'm gonna use burnt ochre now. The correct direction. And you know, as you get out here and the feathers get larger, it may actually help you to outline those feathers first. Just so that you maintain the like right direction of texture. That makes sense on the feathers. And then for some of the deeper areas on that top edge, I'm going to use terracotta. You want your pencil to be very sharp when you're drawing stiff feathers like this. Because they're short, they're not very big. Okay, and you can up the contrast a little bit along the edge too by using something like a burnt sienna along this edge. Okay, and then also along the top edge, sort of where it starts to turn to gray, you can put a little burnt sienna. And then, of course, it starts to get lighter as you go out here. So I am going to continue to use cadmium orange, but I'm not going to use pressure that's quite as hard as I did before. Make sure that's erased nicely. And to help you as a guide with these kinds of feathers, where it starts to get lighter, I would take a fairly sharp pencil that is burnt ochre or something similar, and just outline some of those. This. And really look at the shape of those feathers. If you can zoom in, that's awesome. The shape and the size of the feathers. And notice how they're overlapping each other. It's really like a scaled pattern, basically. Zoom in a little bit. And you're using, it's almost like dots. Very short lines for the edges. This owl, you know, Owls have that facial disc because it funnels sound to their ears. They want to have this fairly distinct line here. It's like they have a radar dish. And the stiff feathers around the edge help to do that. It's like a lip around the edge. So yeah, that just gives you an idea of how to do that. And then you can take the cadmium orange and add some of that. You know what though, actually? That's pretty golden. It's a pretty golden color. So I would actually first take a light yellow, like a light cadmium yellow for the base layer, just to preserve some of the golden highlights. Going in the direction of the barbs, pretty much. I'm sorry for changing my mind. I tend to do that sometimes. And then take the cadmium orange and go starting basically at the base of the feather and working up, and just put some of that in, but don't go quite to the very, very edge of it. So you're going to be going just almost to the edge so you can preserve that yellow, golden yellow highlight. Just like that. And normally I would not be putting my hand right on this. I'd have a piece of paper in between, but I just want to make sure that everybody can see everything. Because the oils from your hands can kind of get on pictures, but for the purposes of this, it doesn't really matter that much. All right. And then finally, I shouldn't say finally, second to finally, you can take the burnt ochre and do the same thing. Start at the base and work your way up a little. Use a little bit of that. Making sure especially to define the edge of this whitish grayish part as well. And now I will say finally, I am going to use the Caput Mortuum. Burnt sienna would also work for this, for sort of the darkest, brightest parts at the base of those feathers. Can also add a little bit of it in here too. So we do have above these feathers a kind of border where it's quite golden, and for that it's really, really light. I'm going to use cream, which is like a light whitish yellow, for this border here. And add a little bit cadmium orange in spots, but that really is a pretty light part there, and you can border it at the top with cadmium orange as well. And we'll talk more soon about getting into that gray part, but I don't want to get to that quite yet. Alright. So now, zoom out slightly. For the sides, you've really got a pretty similar thing going on, but I just want to talk a little bit about, this side's going to be pretty similar. You have a bit of a highlight here where I would use the cream again and some cadmium yellow, but it's pretty much the same as the top. But I want to talk about this transition area where it's really dark and then it starts to get up into here, because you do have definitely around the edges like some dark sepia here. So I'm going to erase the graphite border. And I will start this area with the cadmium orange. And it's almost like you have sort of 3 ruffled layers of feathers here, which this is just a base layer. So you can just try to basically get the proper direction going on here, but we're going to go over the top with quite a few other colors too, so it doesn't have to be perfect. You may want to smooth it out a little too with like the cream. Make sure you could see that. There we go. So now I'm gonna outline, because the edges of these feathers are fairly defined. I am gonna use the dark sepia first. So when I have, just want to tell you a little bit about how I decide if I want to start like with the dark areas first. If it's pretty defined like that, it's good to outline a little bit, just so you have a guide. So I'm going to start with this bottom edge here with the dark sepia. It's really pretty dark there. And that line is particularly thick right here along the bottom. So try to have these lines go sort of in a few different directions, basically. And then we have a second layer here. And it can help to include some of those little triangles, which is where some of the barbs have separated, because that makes it look a little bit more natural. But those feathers are so overlapped, it's almost like it looks like one continuous mass, but you can sort of separate them out with some little lines in places. like he's got a little, very, very short mane of feathers. And then here we can also darken up this edge a little. Keeping in mind the direction of the barbs of the white and grayish feathers. And then for the shadowy areas, I've already got these dark sepia colors in, but we can also add a little bit of, I would say, burnt sienna here. And think about, I like to really try and think about it being 3D. So imagine almost that your pencil is going up underneath that upper layer of feathers. That kind of visualization can be very helpful, especially if you're a visual learner. And you can smooth out the shadows with cadmium orange. But you may need to bring in some more shadows if it gets too light. So like you can take the dark sepia again and get those really dark areas in. And I would keep layering and keep working on that. At least for mine, I'm not quite getting that look quite yet of like this layer is above that layer quite yet. I have a little more darkness down here too. With, you know, other feathers that are sticking out along this edge. The nice thing about colored pencil is you can keep on adding many, many layers, and especially if you're using art paper like this bristle paper that I'm using, the paper will be able to handle it. You can add tons of layers, like professional colored pencil artists, some of them will use tens of layers or, you know, a whole lot of layers. I usually don't use like a ton of layers, but at least a few. Like at the very least 3, sometimes 4 or 5. It's because that layering is what's going to make it really look 3D. And the layering will gradually come together pretty much. And then as you transition up into here, you know, you've got still that dark edge going on, but gradually some of these feathers are going to start getting lighter. And you have light hitting along here. So you want to show that you have that contrast going on. Which you can do by somewhat abruptly ending that burnt sienna shadow and using more of your burnt ochre and terracotta, light pressure of the terracotta. I hope this is making sense and I'm not getting too overboard with all the colors because I feel like I'm starting to. And then, yeah, as you move up, you can erase the graphite and just keep on going with those feathers. You have some pretty bright orange in spots. I may need to widen that border a little bit too. So think about, you really have 3 layers of feathers here, which I might bring my third on the outside edge here. And then again, because you have that golden kind of thing going on, you can use like a cream as a base layer. And then maybe as you move up and you have that really bright spot, some yellow, like this light cadmium yellow. And then you just want to start layering over the top of that with terracotta and burnt ochre. A little bit of burnt sienna in your shadows. But these feathers, you know, see, they have a very rounded shape to them, and are pretty wide too. Getting feather shape right is pretty important. It's especially important when you're drawing birds in flight. And if you're drawing birds that have really large wing coverts, getting that feather shape right. Starting out by getting the wing shape right when you do your pencil lines is good, but then you really want to get the shape of especially the wingtip feathers, the wingtip primaries, you want to get that right. Because that's like a part of the character of the bird, of the species. And it's going to vary for each one. And that's something lately that I feel like I've improved on. Sometimes I would draw a bird's wing and be like, that wing shape is not quite exactly right. And it just takes a lot of close study and zooming in. Walnut brown can be good for some of these shadows too. Pretty neutral, darkish brown mixed with a dark sepia. Also try to pay attention to the width of the shadows. Where it starts to get lighter, the shadows are going to be a very thin line, and then where it starts to get darker, the shadows line is going to get a little bit wider. All right. That's a start anyway. I'm going to keep, doing some more layering, but especially try to get this contrast here. Right along that edge. Which the contrast decreases as you go up into these lighter areas, of course, but you have more of it, especially right here, kind of at that turning point. And the parts that are pretty bright, try to keep that kind of isolated. And if you do accidentally start to draw into that area, then you can just erase. Especially if you have an electric eraser, that'll work fairly well. And smoothing out shadows can really help too to get that three-dimensional feel. But just remember, when you're doing it, to stay in that lower layer and not venture up into the upper layer. Because that'll help you with your contrast, basically. And when you're smoothing, you can use pretty dark pressure. It's really pretty dark all the way down for most of this until we get right below the bill. And remember too, I did some of this on my own, but remember to bring in some darker grays here, which is that bell shadow, which again, you want to show the three-dimensionalness. It's not really a word. And to help you do that, you can have like a fairly hard line here and then blend over into here, and it will start to look like that beak is popping out towards you, which is always really fun. Oh, and we should also talk about the rictal bristles. I almost forgot. So the rictal bristles, that's a really fun part to draw. They're like the whiskers on the bird. So they come out like this. Just want to show you, and then you can try it. Have a very sharp pencil for this, by the way. And the function of these has been debated, you know. It may be, at least for things like flycatchers and some other insect-eating birds, it may help to protect the face, kind of, if they're eating something like a moth that has really big wings. I don't know for an owl, though. Not sure. And then we have these feathers here that kind of come like this. We have like a shadow there. But this is the thing where you have to kind of just go for it. And like let your pencil do its thing, but have a plan in your mind for what direction you're going. It's like with whiskers on a mammal. Dark whiskers on a mammal anyway. White whiskers on a mammal are tricky, and I actually use my electric eraser for that. It's tough. Maybe at some point we'll do a tutorial on that. And then you also have a shadow along here. So you can use some gray for that. Whoops. Like a warm gray 6. He looks like he's smiling almost now. All right. We've made a pretty good progress here, I'd say. But you can just continue working on this edge of the facial disc here. And you could also get started, you know, if you want to, on the other side of the face. Especially the lower edge of the cheek is going to be a pretty similar technique. You do have a little bit more light hitting this cheek, so keep that in mind. But, you know, this whole area is pretty similar to the other side of the face. So feel free to work on that in the coming week. I am planning to have another class next weekend. I know it's a long weekend for some people, but if you're not able to attend at 8 p.m. on Saturday, you can always watch it later on too. And you can always ask me questions later on. You can comment on the video or send me a message. Either of those works. Thank you very much for joining this evening, or this day, depending on where you are. I hope you had a great time, and I hope you've learned some interesting tips about drawing barn owls. So next week we'll be talking about the top of the head, this area up here, and then some of these areas around the side. And then, if anybody has questions about this part, we can also talk about that. But in the meantime, I'm going to fill in some of these areas a little bit too. All right, thank you very much. Bye.